Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the Vicente Sederberg Professor of Marijuana Law and Policy at the Sturm College of Law, Sam Kamin.
Hi, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for coming today and for the invitation to come here and speak. I am the Vicente Sederberg Professor of Marijuana Law and Policy here at DU. As you'd imagine, this is not something that was a childhood dream of mine. It's something I stumbled into in 2009. I was sitting in a coffee shop here in Denver, and I was looking at the back page of the Westward, and there were pages of color ads explaining that ounces of marijuana could be bought for $250, and what strains they had and where you could find it. And I thought, ignorantly, I thought that was illegal. Why do these folks feel so free to advertise in the paper that they are breaking federal law? I've come a long way in 7 years in my understanding of the relationship between state and federal law, but that was sort of my first thought about this. I started researching and writing in this area, and then in November of 2012, I got a late night call from the News and Public Affairs person here at DU who said, Amendment 64 just passed. And I said, what? These things don't pass. What do you mean it passed? He said, your phone's going to be ringing off the hook in the morning. And he was right, and it hasn't really stopped since. So I'd like to tell you a little bit today about what I've been working on, my involvement in this area, in this field, both here in Denver and beyond. You could be forgiven, as I hope I would be, for forgetting, living here in Colorado, that marijuana is still illegal under federal law. The big grow facilities, the lovely retail shops that we have here, all of those folks are violating federal law with every sale, with every plant. The people that buy from them, their customers, are also violating federal law. And the federal government has chosen, for the moment, not to put those people in prison, but their conduct remains illegal. While that remains true, a number of states have begun to see marijuana differently. In 1996, all 50 states had a parallel to the Federal Controlled Substances Act, criminalizing marijuana conduct in their own states. Since then, in the last 20 years, 23 states have made marijuana available for people who need it for medical purposes. And 4 states, and the District of Columbia, have made it available for all adults. That is, small amounts of marijuana are not criminal under our laws. We have a regulatory and licensing, and most importantly, tax regime for marijuana here in Colorado. And this is growing, pardon the pun. I really didn't mean that one. 6 to 10 states will have marijuana on their ballots this fall, and we can expect that by January 1st, 2017, something north of 27, 28, 29 states will have some sort of marijuana legalization on their books. That is, they will permit some adults to have marijuana, even as the Federal Controlled Substances Act is in place. So there's obviously a conflict here between the federal government prohibiting something that an increasing number of states are seeing as useful for patients and available for responsible adults. What happens with the federal law? The Obama administration, after some fits and starts, has announced a policy of non-enforcement, that the Justice Department has announced that for those in compliance with robust state regulatory regimes, it is not a good use of federal law enforcement resources to go after those people to put them into jail. It's essentially forbearance on the part of federal prosecutors. But it's just forbearance. It's not legalization. The Controlled Substances Act remains in place. All that conduct, as I said, remains illegal, and that has significant consequences. It has consequences both for consumers, that is, people who are using and buying marijuana, and it has consequences for those who serve them, those who are taking part in this new regulated marijuana regime. For consumers, the risks, including the remote risk of a change in policy and arrest and imprisonment, that's fairly remote. Other risks, however, are much more present. So most of you, I'm sure, have heard of Brendan Coates. He is a quadriplegic who was working for Dish Network. He is a medical marijuana patient. He tested positive when he was drug tested by his employer, and he said to them, of course, I tested positive for marijuana. I take it to control seizures. It's the only way I'm able to work here. Dish Network told him that they had a zero tolerance policy for illegal substances, and he was fired. He argued that his conduct was permitted under Colorado's lawful off-duty conduct statute, which surprisingly says that you cannot be fired for engaging in lawful off-duty conduct. He says, well, that's what I did. The voters of the state have said I can have this as medicine. I don't see how I can be fired. The Colorado Supreme Court unanimously held that he could be fired. They said that his conduct was not lawful because it continued to be prohibited by federal law. His conduct was still criminal, and even though he wasn't being arrested, even though he wasn't going to go to jail, his employer was within its rights to fire him. Other consequences that people risk when they use marijuana, even pursuant to state law, include losing parental rights. There was recently a story in the Denver Post about a family that moved here from Kansas to take advantage of medical marijuana and having 5 of their 6 children taken from them. In addition, anyone with student loans, anyone that takes money from the federal government, including universities, risks losing that if their use of marijuana is made public. So these are really profound consequences. The fact that you could lose your public housing, for example, if any member of your family is caught with marijuana for which they have a doctor's recommendation here in Colorado, really undercuts the ability of Coloradans to carry out their stated desire to have medical marijuana legal. For businesses, those trying to comply with state regulatory and licensing laws, the consequences are obviously less personal. They're not life and death. They're not your children or your livelihood, but they are pronounced. So, here, the biggest one that most people know about is the banking problem. Because banks are federally regulated, most will not do business with anyone in the marijuana industry. That means that Colorado has a $1 billion, last year, $1 billion marijuana industry that deals almost entirely in cash. That's really bad for a couple of reasons. One is, it puts the people who run these businesses, it puts their employees at risk. Right? When you have both illicit substances and large amounts of cash present in the same place, those people are at risk for robbery, the employees as well as the owners. Furthermore, from a regulatory perspective, if the state is concerned about making sure that all the money that's taken in is taxed, making sure that the money flows to licensed owners and not to those associated with criminal behavior, the fact that there are no records, that this is entirely done in cash, makes that incredibly difficult, right? So this is a situation where both the regulated and the regulators' interests are aligned. Everyone agrees that banking would be the best thing for the industry, and to date, despite the fact that lots of people want to fix this problem and lots of money is at stake, no solution is possible so long as the federal prohibition remains in place. There are other consequences in terms of the unavailability of intellectual property and the unavailability of bankruptcy protections. All these federal protections are simply unavailable to those doing business in this area. So I call this an uneasy truce. I argue that we can't continue to go on this way, right? That we can't have billion-dollar businesses run entirely in cash, where every person every day runs the risk that they will lose their livelihood and their business, right? In addition to all these other things that they're putting at risk. So it certainly seems that with 30 states possibly having medical marijuana laws by 2017, we're reaching a tipping point. That is that the situation where 30 states are authorizing something the federal government prohibits, that simply is untenable going forward. And then a lot of people say, so this is all going to change in 2017, and I say, well, maybe 2017 is the year, but it's not a simple question of whether the federal prohibition will go away, but what will take its place. Excuse me. And in thinking about models to replace the current prohibition, it's important to think about in what ways does marijuana like or dislike other things that states and federal governments regulate. So right now, marijuana is classified as a Schedule I narcotic under the Controlled Substances Act. That means it's treated like heroin, like LSD, as a drug with no medical benefit. Right? Cocaine is actually a Schedule II drug. It can be prescribed. Marijuana cannot. Why do we criminalize hard drugs? Why do we say these things are illegal? Well, prohibition works. It's not perfect, but it works. If we criminalize conduct, fewer people will engage in that conduct. We criminalize things like heroin because we think the stigma, the costs associated with it, the more we are able to, as a society, marginalize that conduct, the fewer people will engage in it. Now, we know that that's not perfect, but that's the approach that we've taken. Contrast that with what we do with Schedule II through V drugs under the Controlled Substances Act. These are prescription drugs, right? Things like OxyContin, things like codeine. You can get a prescription from a doctor, but they're heavily regulated. Maybe you can only get it refilled certain times. Maybe you have to go in person rather than being able to phone in. We think, well, these are dangerous substances. These are substances we have to control, but we think that there's medical benefit that outweighs the risks. Alcohol, tobacco. These are other substances that society regulates, but clearly not as stringently as those above. Tobacco, by sort of conservative accounts, kills 400,000 people each year. But it's not criminalized. It's taxed. It's regulated. Restrictions are placed on how it can be advertised, how it can be targeted, and it's heavily taxed. We see it as a source of revenue. Right? Part of the tobacco settlement with the states when they sued was they got revenue into the state coffers in exchange for withholding their suits. Alcohol, the federal government regulates it, but leaves to the states to determine what the best way of dealing with it is. Herbal supplements, sort of further down this list, the federal government says, look, we're not going to carefully monitor these things. We think the risks are relatively low. We'll keep people from being able to make medical claims they can't support. We will look to see if they're harmful. But if they're not harmful and people aren't making extravagant claims about them, we'll allow them to be sold. The last one here may surprise you. I used a phrase in my class the other day and no one got it. Has anyone heard the phrase a numbers runner? Right? The student zero, literally no student had ever heard that phrase. I felt old. Right, numbers runners were people running lotteries. They were running illegal underground lotteries, and they were profiting thereby. There was loan sharking that was associated with it. At some point, state, local government said, well, this is crazy. Why are we letting them have all the fun? Why are we letting them get all this revenue? We should legalize this thing. We should run it ourselves. We should get all the profits for ourselves. Great idea. Except that we know the lottery is about the most regressive tax that we have access to, right? For every dollar that someone gives to the lottery, they get back 50 cents, right? And so that's just sort of they pay out 50% of what they take in prizes. So it's a terrible investment. It's an investment that's attractive to people who don't have a lot of options, but it's also seen by governments as a good source of revenue. So, okay, you say to me, which of these are we going to use? Which of these looks most like marijuana in terms of its benefits and its harms? Let's do that. The short answer, so what's the right answer? The short answer is, it depends. Right? I'm a law professor, I don't give answers, I ask questions. It depends. It depends on what? It depends on what priorities we have as a society and what priorities we have with regard to this substance. So one priority might be harm reduction. We might say, look, we know that people are going to use marijuana. We should take it out of the black market. We should make sure that it is healthful, that it doesn't have pesticides. That's been in the news a lot. But otherwise, we should allow people to use this substance that they seem to have a real appetite for. The most classic example of harm reduction is needle exchanges, right? That we know people are going to use heroin, notwithstanding our criminalization of it. We should make needles available so they don't die of hepatitis and AIDS. Right? And the idea there is a recognition of reality, a recognition that we should be interested in protecting people from themselves, but that we don't think prohibition is the way to go about that. Sort of along those lines is the idea of a free enterprise. Right in Colorado, with our marijuana market, has about the freest market in marijuana that exists in the country. We don't have a limit on the number of licenses that are given out. We've decided the market should tell us that. We will license it, we will tax it. If you produce too much and can't sell it, well, that's your problem. Medical access, we could say that, yes, we should have marijuana. Yes, it should be legal. Yes, it's stupid to prohibit it. Yes, people want it, but it should be available as medicine. And that means that it shouldn't be smoked. That means that it should be available only on a doctor's recommendation or maybe on a doctor's prescription, the way we do with other controlled substances like OxyContin, like other opiates, available but regulated, narrowly available. Or we could say, no, this looks like the lottery to us, right? That this has been, we've allowed gangs and cartels to run this for a while. It's time for us to run it, right? We can make money off this thing. We think it's relatively harmless. We should be doing this ourselves. Again, these are public policy choices. They're public policy choices that are being made now. As I study the marijuana industry, both here in Colorado and around the country, I see companies positioning themselves for one of these models. There are marijuana businesses that say, we don't like the Colorado model where, you sell marijuana to smoke and you sell these sort of elaborate rigs for smoking. If it's medicine, let's make pills. And they produce only pills. They're looking forward to a 2017 where marijuana is treated like other painkillers. Right? Others are saying, we want to be the Budweiser of marijuana. We want to be the Philip Morris. We think a free enterprise model is great. It's what made America great. We should go forth and do that. So the takeaway is, it's not whether we're going to do away with the federal prohibition that's currently in place, but how. What's going to come and replace it? The other piece I'll leave you with, having seen what's happened here in Colorado and participated in it to a certain extent, it's not a one-time process, right? It's iterative. We try this. No one in the country before Colorado did it had ever legalized this. Nobody in the world had ever tried to legalize marijuana. The state of Colorado wrote some rules, wrote some regulations, did really well. Didn't get everything right, went back and tried to fix it. We're not going to get everything right with marijuana on the national level. It's going to take some hard decisions about these various policy priorities, and it's going to take going back and working hard to try to make it better. Thank you.